In the grand corridors of power where secrets are currency and truth is a luxury few can afford, one moment can shatter centuries of carefully constructed lies. Behind the golden gates and marble walls, where the world believes they see perfection, a single revelation is about to expose the most shocking truth in royal history. What happens when the very foundation of a monarchy crumbles in an instant? When trusted advisors become enemies, when family members turn against each other, and when the media descends like vultures on fresh prey. This is not a fairy tale. This is the raw, unfiltered account of how one explosive secret tore apart the most powerful royal family in Europe, leaving nothing but chaos, betrayal, and a fight for survival that would determine the fate of a 1,000-year-old crown. The revelation came at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. By 4 p.m., everything had changed forever. Welcome to the 13 minutes that brought down a kingdom. Princess Isabella had always known that Tuesday afternoons in the palace were reserved for the most sensitive discussions. The mahogany-paneled room on the third floor, with its heavy curtains and soundproof walls, had witnessed countless family secrets over the decades. But nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to hear on this particular October afternoon. She sat across from her father, King Marcus, watching his weathered hands tremble as he held a manila envelope. At 68, the king had ruled for 35 years with an iron will and unwavering composure. Isabella had never seen him look so defeated, so utterly broken. "There's something you need to know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something that changes everything we've believed about our family, about our right to rule, about who we really are." Isabella's heart began to race. As the heir apparent, she had been prepared for many difficult conversations about duty, sacrifice, and the burden of the crown. But the look in her father's eyes suggested this was something far more serious than matters of state or royal protocol. The envelope contained documents that had been hidden in a secret compartment within the palace walls for over 40 years. Workers renovating the East Wing had discovered them just 3 days earlier, and the royal historian had spent sleepless nights verifying their authenticity. The conclusion was undeniable. Everything the royal family had built their legitimacy upon was a lie. King Marcus opened the envelope with shaking fingers and spread the contents across the polished table. Birth certificates, adoption papers, medical records, and a handwritten confession that would shake the monarchy to its core. Isabella leaned forward, her eyes scanning the documents that would change her life forever. The truth was devastating in its simplicity. The man she had called father her entire life, the king who had ruled with divine authority, was not of royal blood. He had been adopted as an infant by the previous king and queen after their biological son had died in infancy. The royal bloodline, traced back over 1,000 years, had actually ended with that unnamed baby prince 40 years ago. Isabella stared at the adoption papers dated just days after her grandfather had announced the birth of his heir. The conspiracy had been orchestrated by the former queen and a small circle of trusted advisors who feared that the truth about the prince's death would destabilize the kingdom during a time of great political unrest. "But this means," Isabella began, her voice trailing off as the implications hit her like a physical blow. "It means we have no legitimate claim to the throne," King Marcus finished. "It means that every decision I've made, every law I've signed, every war I've prevented or waged has been based on a fundamental lie. It means that you, my dear daughter, are not truly a princess by blood." The weight of this revelation crushed down upon Isabella like a collapsing building. Her entire identity, her purpose, her future, everything she had been raised to believe about herself was crumbling in real time. She thought about the thousands of people who had bowed to her, the diplomats who had treated her with reverence, the citizens who had placed their faith in the royal family's divine right to rule. King Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger as he faced the truth he had carried alone for 3 agonizing days. "There's more. The documents suggest that there may be legitimate heirs still alive. Distant cousins who were passed over when my father took the throne. People who have been living as commoners while we've occupied their rightful place." Isabella felt the room spinning around her. She gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady herself as waves of nausea washed over her. "Who else knows about this?" "Dr. Harrison, the royal historian who authenticated the documents." James Mitchell, the construction foreman who found them. And now you. King Marcus paused, looking directly into his daughter's eyes. But, by tomorrow, the entire world will know. We can't keep this secret. Too many people were involved in the discovery. The princess closed her eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what lay ahead. She thought about her younger brother Prince Edward, currently studying at Oxford, blissfully unaware that his world was about to implode. She thought about her mother, Queen Catherine, who had dedicated her life to royal service and charitable work, believing she was serving a higher purpose. "What are we going to do?" Isabella asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded despite the chaos raging in her mind. King Marcus stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens where he had played as a child, believing he was destined for greatness. "We're going to tell the truth. We're going to face the consequences with dignity. And we're going to help find the rightful heirs to the throne, even if it means giving up everything we've ever known." Isabella joined him at the window, looking out at the perfectly manicured lawns where she had learned to ride horses, where she had hosted garden parties for foreign dignitaries, where she had believed she was preparing to rule. "When do we tell the family?" "Tonight. I've called an emergency family meeting for 8 o'clock. We'll tell Edward and your mother together. Tomorrow morning, we'll inform the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. By noon tomorrow, we'll hold a press conference to announce everything to the public." The finality in his voice made everything real. In less than 24 hours, their lives as they knew them would be over. Isabella thought about the media storm that would follow, the political chaos that would ensue, the international implications of a monarchy discovering it had no legitimate authority. "Father," she said, using the title that now carried a different weight, "are you afraid?" King Marcus turned to face her, and, for the first time since she was a child, Isabella saw her father not as a king, but as a man who had lived his entire life believing in a lie, who had made decisions that affected millions of people based on false authority, who now faced the complete destruction of everything he had worked to build. Terrified, he admitted, but also, strangely, relieved. "I've carried the weight of the crown my entire life, never feeling truly worthy of it. Now I know why. Some part of me always sensed that something wasn't right, that I was somehow an imposter." The documents explained everything. Isabella nodded, understanding flooding through her. She had always felt the same way, a sense that she was playing a role rather than living an authentic life. The revelation was horrifying, but it also provided an odd sense of clarity. As they stood together in silence, both lost in their own thoughts, neither of them noticed the figure lurking in the shadows outside the room. Palace walls had ears, and secrets had a way of escaping even the most secure locations. Their careful plan to control the revelation was about to encounter its first major obstacle. Dr. Harrison, the royal historian, had left the palace an hour earlier with a troubled expression and a briefcase full of copies of the damaging documents. Unknown to the royal family, he had already made several phone calls to colleagues at other institutions, seeking second opinions on the authentication process. Meanwhile, James Mitchell, the construction foreman, had been unable to keep the discovery to himself. He had mentioned it to his wife over dinner the previous evening, swearing her to secrecy, but not accounting for the fact that she volunteered at the local newspaper and was close friends with several journalists. By the time Isabella and her father finished their conversation, 3 separate news outlets were already working to verify rumors of a major royal scandal. The carefully planned revelation was about to become an uncontrolled explosion. As evening approached and the family prepared to gather for the most difficult conversation of their lives, they remained unaware that their window of control was rapidly closing. The 13 minutes that would change everything were still hours away, but the fuse had already been lit. The palace, with all its grandeur and security, was about to become the center of the biggest constitutional crisis in modern history. And Isabella, the princess who was about to discover she wasn't really a princess at all, would find herself at the very heart of a storm that would test every assumption about power, legitimacy, and truth in the modern world. The revelation was just the beginning. The real story was about to unfold in ways that no one could predict or control. The family meeting that evening was supposed to be private, controlled, and carefully managed. Instead, It became the first domino in a series of events that would bring down not just the royal family, but the entire political establishment that had built their power around the monarchy's legitimacy. Queen Catherine entered the mahogany room at exactly 8 o'clock, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the urgency of the summons. At 59, she had spent 30 years as queen consort, dedicating herself to charitable causes and diplomatic functions with unwavering grace. Her composure had been legendary throughout numerous political crises and personal scandals. Prince Edward arrived moments later, still wearing his Oxford University sweatshirt and looking annoyed at being summoned home on such short notice. At 23, he was everything a modern prince was supposed to be: intelligent, charming, and committed to using his position for social good. He had been preparing for a life of service, believing deeply in the monarchy's role as a force for stability and progress. King Marcus waited until they were seated before beginning the conversation that would shatter their world. He spoke slowly and clearly, laying out the facts without emotion or embellishment. The documents, the adoption, the 40-year deception, the implications for their legitimacy, everything. The Queen's reaction was immediate and devastating. The woman who had maintained perfect composure through decades of public scrutiny began to hyperventilate, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. She had given up her own career as a successful diplomat to marry into the royal family, believing she was serving something greater than herself. 30 years, she whispered, her voice breaking. 30 years of my life built on a lie. Every charity I've supported, every hospital I've opened, every speech I've given about the crown's sacred duty, all of it meaningless. Prince Edward's response was different, but equally intense. He stood up abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. This is impossible. There has to be some mistake. The documents must be forgeries. Someone is trying to destroy us. Isabella watched her family fall apart in real time, each of them processing the revelation through their own lens of loss and disbelief. She felt oddly detached from the scene, as if she were observing strangers rather than her own flesh and blood. The shock of the afternoon had given way to a strange numbness that made everything feel surreal. King Marcus continued with the practical details of their situation. They would need to locate the legitimate heirs, arrange for the constitutional transition of power, and manage the media storm that was about to break. He had already contacted the palace's legal team and crisis management specialists, though he hadn't yet revealed the full scope of the situation. "We have to control this narrative," Edward said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he had learned from years of royal training. "We can't just announce that the monarchy is illegitimate. It would destabilize the entire country." "We don't have a choice," Isabella replied quietly. "The truth is already getting out. Father told me that several people know about the discovery. We can't cover this up even if we wanted to." As if summoned by her words, there was a sharp knock on the door. Thomas Bradley, the palace's head of security, entered with an expression that made it clear he was the bearer of bad news. "Your Majesty," he said, addressing King Marcus with a formality that felt suddenly absurd. "We have a situation. 3 separate news organizations have contacted the palace press office in the last hour asking for comment on rumors about the royal family's legitimacy. They seem to have partial information, but are looking for confirmation." The room fell silent. Their carefully planned timeline had just collapsed. Instead of having until tomorrow to prepare their announcement, they now had hours before the story broke whether they wanted it to or not. "Which outlets?" King Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the crisis escalating around him. "The Guardian, Sky News, and the BBC. Their inquiries suggest they have sources within the palace or connected to the construction project. They're asking about discovered documents and questions of royal lineage." Queen Catherine finally spoke, her voice hollow. "It's over, isn't it? Everything we've worked for, everything we've believed in, it's all over." Isabella found herself thinking about the people outside the palace walls who still believed in the monarchy, who saw the royal family as symbols of stability and tradition. By tomorrow, those beliefs would be shattered. The political implications were staggering, not just for the monarchy, but for the entire constitutional framework of the country. Edward was already thinking tactically. "We need to get ahead of this story. If we're going to announce the truth, we need to do it on our terms with our narrative. We can't let the media control how this information comes out. Thomas Bradley cleared his throat. There's something else, Your Majesty. We've had unusual activity around the palace perimeter tonight. More photographers than usual, several news vans parked nearby. The story is already building momentum even without official confirmation. King Marcus made the decision that would define how history remembered this moment. Call an emergency press conference for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. We'll tell the complete truth. Thomas, I need you to coordinate with the Prime Minister's office immediately. The government needs to be informed before this becomes public. As the family meeting dissolved into crisis management mode, none of them noticed that their conversation was being monitored by someone with access to the palace's internal security systems. The revelation they were struggling to control was already in the hands of people who had no intention of managing it carefully. Dr. Sarah Williams, a genealogy researcher at Cambridge University, had received an urgent call from Dr. Harrison earlier that evening. She was now working through the night, tracing the royal bloodline and identifying potential legitimate heirs. Her research was uncovering information that would complicate the situation far beyond what the royal family had imagined. The legitimate heirs weren't just distant cousins living quiet lives as commoners. One was a successful businesswoman in Manchester who had no idea of her royal connection. Another was serving as a captain in the British Army, currently deployed overseas. A third was a teacher in Scotland whose great-grandmother had always claimed royal blood but was dismissed as eccentric. These people were about to have their lives turned upside down by a heritage they never knew existed. More importantly, they would soon face a choice that no one should have to make: accept a crown they never wanted and didn't understand, or allow a constitutional crisis to unfold that could destabilize the entire country. Meanwhile, the political establishment was beginning to sense that something major was about to break. Phone calls were being made between government officials, constitutional lawyers, and parliamentary leaders. The machinery of damage control was beginning to turn, even though most people still didn't know what they were trying to control. James Mitchell, the construction foreman who had found the documents, was at home with his family, unaware that his discovery had set in motion events that would reshape British politics. His wife had already shared the story with her journalist friends, who were now working their sources to verify the incredible claims. The palace staff, many of whom had dedicated their entire careers to serving the royal family, were beginning to sense that something was wrong. Security briefings were more intense than usual, communications with outside were being restricted, and there was an energy of barely contained panic running through the hallways. Isabella found herself thinking about the ordinary people who would be affected by tomorrow's revelation. The small business owners who relied on royal tourism, the journalists whose careers were built around covering the monarchy, the citizens who found meaning and identity in their connection to the crown. All of their lives were about to change because of documents hidden in a wall for 40 years. As midnight approached and the family finally disbanded to try to get some rest before the storm, Isabella stood alone in her private chambers looking out at the city lights beyond the palace walls. Tomorrow, everything would be different. The woman in the mirror would no longer be a princess. The crown jewels would lose their meaning, and the 1,000-year-old institution they had all served would begin its final chapter. She thought about the irony of the situation. For years, she had questioned whether the monarchy was still relevant in the modern world. Now, she was about to discover that it had never been legitimate in the first place. The crisis that was about to unfold would answer her questions about relevance in the most dramatic way possible. The 13 minutes that would change everything were still hours away, but the countdown had already begun. By tomorrow morning, the careful world of royal protocol and constitutional tradition would be replaced by chaos, revelation, and a struggle for power that no one was prepared to handle. In less than 9 hours, the most powerful monarchy in Europe would cease to exist as the world had known it. The real question was what would rise from its ashes. The morning of the revelation began at 6:47 a.m. when Prime Minister David Richardson received the phone call that would define his political career. He was in his Downing Street study, reviewing briefing papers for the day's parliamentary session, when his private secretary informed him that King Marcus needed to speak with him immediately about a matter of national importance. Richardson had served as prime minister for 4 years and had developed what he considered a good working relationship with the royal family. He had managed several minor scandals and constitutional questions during his tenure, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to hear. King Marcus's voice was steady but strained as he explained the discovery of the documents and their implications. The Prime Minister listened in stunned silence, taking notes that he would later realize were meaningless scribbles as his mind struggled to process the magnitude of the crisis. "How certain are you of the document's authenticity?" Richardson asked, his political instincts immediately focusing on the possibility that this was some elaborate hoax or conspiracy. "Completely certain. We've had them examined by 3 independent experts. There's no doubt about their legitimacy or their implications." The king paused. "David, we're calling a press conference for 9 o'clock. I wanted you to hear this from me before the announcement." Richardson looked at his watch. It was 7:15 a.m. He had less than 2 hours to prepare for a constitutional crisis that would make Brexit look like a minor policy disagreement. The government's entire relationship with the monarchy, the legal foundation of parliamentary authority, and the country's international standing were all about to be called into question. After ending the call with King Marcus, the Prime Minister immediately contacted his deputy, the Attorney General, and the Cabinet Secretary. Within minutes, an emergency meeting was convened in the Cabinet Office briefing room, the same secure facility used during terrorist attacks and major international crises. The Attorney General, Margaret Thornton, was the first to grasp the full legal implications. If the royal family has no legitimate claim to the throne, then technically every law passed during the current king's reign could be challenged. Every government formed in his name, every treaty signed with his authority, every judicial appointment made with royal approval, all of it becomes questionable. The constitutional implications were staggering. The United Kingdom's entire system of government was built around the principle of the Crown in Parliament. If the Crown was illegitimate, what did that mean for Parliament's authority? What about the civil service, the military, the courts, all institutions that derive their authority from the Crown? Meanwhile, across London, the newsrooms of major media outlets were buzzing with activity. The Guardian's political editor, Jennifer Walsh, had been working since 5 a.m. to verify the rumors she had received the previous evening. Her sources within the palace were confirming that something major was about to break, but no one was willing to provide specifics. At the BBC, the royal correspondent Sarah Chun was dealing with a similar situation. She had covered the royal family for 15 years and had developed a network of reliable sources throughout the palace and government. The fragments of information she was gathering painted a picture so extraordinary that she was struggling to believe it could be true. Dr. Sarah Williams at Cambridge had worked through the night and was now armed with information that would complicate the situation beyond anything the royal family had anticipated. Her genealogical research had identified not just 3 potential legitimate heirs, but 7. More troubling still, her analysis suggested that the adoption 40 years ago might not have been the first time the royal bloodline had been artificially maintained. The documents found in the palace wall were apparently part of a larger collection that had been split up and hidden in multiple locations throughout the palace and other royal residences. The implication was that the royal family's legitimacy crisis went back much further than anyone had realized, potentially centuries. At 8:15 a.m., the first legitimate heir was contacted. Margaret Foster, a 45-year-old business consultant in Manchester, answered her phone expecting a routine work call. Instead, she found herself speaking with a representative from the royal household who informed her that she might be the rightful heir to the throne of England. Margaret's first response was to hang up, assuming it was an elaborate prank. When the caller persisted and provided details that could only have come from official sources, she agreed to travel to London immediately for an emergency meeting. She left her office without explanation, telling her assistant only that she had a family emergency. Similar calls were being made to Captain James Morrison, currently serving with British forces in Afghanistan, and to Helen MacDonald, a primary school teacher in Edinburgh. Each conversation was surreal, life-changing, and completely outside the realm of normal human experience. Back at the palace, Isabella was struggling with her own crisis of identity. She had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at her reflection and trying to understand who she was if not a princess. The weight of royal expectation had been lifted from her shoulders, but instead of relief, she felt only emptiness. At 8:30 a.m., she received a call from her private secretary informing her that several news organizations were reporting that a major royal announcement was imminent. Social media was already buzzing with speculation, ranging from abdication to scandal to health issues. The truth was so extraordinary that no one was even guessing correctly. Prince Edward had spent the night researching constitutional law, trying to understand what would happen to the monarchy and the government in the aftermath of the revelation. His findings were deeply troubling. The last time Britain had faced a constitutional crisis of this magnitude was during the English Civil War. The precedents were not encouraging. Queen Catherine had retreated into herself, speaking to no one, and spending the night in her private chapel praying for guidance that seemed unlikely to come. The woman who had been the embodiment of royal grace and dignity was struggling with the reality that her entire adult life had been built on a foundation that never existed. At 8:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the scheduled press conference, Thomas Bradley received intelligence that changed everything again. Buckingham Palace was surrounded by hundreds of journalists, photographers, and camera crews. The crowd was larger than anything they had seen for a royal wedding or major state occasion. More concerning was the intelligence suggesting that at least one news organization already had copies of some of the documents. The careful narrative that the royal family had planned to present was about to compete with leaked information that might be taken out of context or misinterpreted. Prime Minister Richardson was facing his own communications crisis. Members of Parliament were demanding to know why they hadn't been informed about a constitutional crisis before the media. The opposition was already preparing to use whatever was announced as ammunition against the government. International allies were calling for clarification about Britain's political stability. The financial markets had begun to react to rumors of a major political announcement. The pound was falling against other currencies as international investors worried about British stability. The FTSE was opening lower as uncertainty spread through the business community. At exactly 9 a.m., King Marcus walked into the palace's state dining room, which had been converted into a press conference venue. The room was packed with more journalists than had ever been assembled for a royal announcement. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation and barely controlled chaos. Isabella, Queen Catherine, and Prince Edward took their seats behind the king, their faces showing the strain of the previous 18 hours. They looked like a family in mourning, which in many ways they were, mourning the death of everything they had believed about themselves and their purpose. King Marcus approached the podium and looked out at the sea of cameras and recording devices that would carry his words around the world within seconds. He took a deep breath and began speaking the words that would change history. Ladies and gentlemen, I am here today to share with you information that fundamentally changes our understanding of the British monarchy and its legitimacy. The room fell silent except for the software of cameras and the scratch of pens on paper. Every person present understood that they were witnessing a moment that would be studied and debated for generations to come. The king continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. 3 days ago, construction workers renovating the east wing of the palace discovered documents that had been hidden within the walls for over 4 decades. After extensive authentication by multiple independent experts, we have confirmed that these documents reveal that I was adopted as an infant following the death of my parents' biological son. The reaction was immediate and intense. Journalists began shouting questions before the king could continue. Camera flashes erupted throughout the room. Several reporters were already typing furiously on their phones, sending the breaking news around the world. But King Marcus wasn't finished. The revelation about his adoption was only the beginning of a story that would prove to be far more complex and far-reaching than anyone in that room could have imagined. The documents had revealed not just one deception, but a pattern of secrets that stretched back through centuries of royal history. As the chaos in the room grew louder and more intense, the 13 minutes that would truly change everything were just beginning to unfold. The carefully planned announcement was about to become something completely different, a moment when centuries of royal authority would collapse in real time, broadcast live to a world that would struggle to comprehend what they were witnessing. The chaos that erupted in the state dining room at 9:03 a.m. was unlike anything in the history of royal press conferences. Journalists were shouting over each other, some standing on chairs to get better camera angles, others pushing toward the podium, demanding answers to questions that King Marcus hadn't even finished asking himself. Jennifer Walsh from The Guardian managed to make her voice heard above the din. "Your Majesty, are you saying that you have no legal right to the throne? What does this mean for the government's authority?" Before the king could respond, Sarah Chun from the BBC followed up with an even more pointed question. "If you're not the legitimate king, who is? Have you identified the rightful heirs?" The questions came faster than King Marcus could answer them, each one revealing new aspects of the crisis that no one had fully considered. The international press corps was frantically trying to understand not just what was happening, but what it meant for Britain's role in international affairs. At 9:07 a.m., something unprecedented happened. Thomas Bradley, the head of palace security, received word that crowds were gathering outside Buckingham Palace. But these weren't the usual tourists and royal watchers. Word of the press conference had spread through social media, and thousands of people were converging on the palace demanding answers. Inside the press conference, King Marcus tried to regain control of the situation. "Please, let me finish explaining the full scope of what we've discovered. The implications go far beyond my personal situation." But the journalists weren't interested in waiting. CNN's London correspondent had already broken into regular programming with a live report. Sky News was broadcasting the press conference live, with expert commentary trying to explain the constitutional implications. The story was exploding across every media platform simultaneously. At 9:10 a.m., Prime Minister Richardson's worst fears began to materialize. His phone was ringing with calls from the President of the United States, the German Chancellor, and the President of France, all demanding to know whether Britain was facing a constitutional collapse. The country's international relationships, built on the assumption of political stability, were being questioned in real time. The financial markets were in freefall. The pound had lost 8% of its value in the 10 minutes since the press conference began. The Bank of England was preparing emergency measures to prevent a complete currency collapse. Major corporations with headquarters in London were fielding calls from concerned investors and international partners. But the most dramatic developments were happening outside the palace walls. Margaret Foster, the businesswoman from Manchester who had been identified as a potential legitimate heir, was stuck in traffic just 2 miles from Buckingham Palace. Her taxi driver had recognized her from news reports that were already identifying her as potentially the rightful Queen of England. "Are you really supposed to be the Queen?" the driver asked, staring at her in his rearview mirror as if she were a mythical creature. Margaret felt surreal discussing her possible royal heritage with a London cabbie while stuck in traffic caused by crowds gathering to witness the collapse of the monarchy. "I honestly don't know," she replied. "Yesterday, I was worried about a quarterly budget report. Today, I might be responsible for running a country I've never thought about ruling." At the palace, King Marcus was trying to explain the discovery of additional documents that suggested the legitimacy crisis went back much further than his own adoption. Dr. Williams's research had uncovered evidence that the royal bloodline had been artificially maintained on at least 3 separate occasions over the past 2 centuries, each time following the death of a legitimate heir. "The documents suggest," the king continued, his voice barely audible over the chaos, "that the institution of the monarchy as we understand it may have been built on a series of necessary deceptions designed to maintain political stability during times of crisis." This revelation sent the room into an even greater frenzy. The implications were staggering, not just for the current royal family, but for the entire historical narrative of British royalty. Centuries of carefully maintained records, genealogical charts, and royal portraits might all be elaborate fiction. At 9:12 a.m., Isabella made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She stood up from her chair behind the podium and walked forward to join her father. The move was completely unplanned and went against every protocol for royal public appearances. "I need to say something," she announced, her voice cutting through the noise with an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her. The room gradually quieted as journalists realized that the princess, or former princess, was about to speak. "You're asking my father to explain a situation that none of us fully understand yet," Isabella began, looking directly into the cameras that were broadcasting her words around the world. But I can tell you what this feels like from the inside. It feels like discovering that your entire life has been a performance in a play you never auditioned for. Her words were raw, honest, and completely unlike anything the public had ever heard from a member of the royal family. The carefully scripted language of royal communication was being replaced by authentic human emotion in real time. "We're not just losing our titles or our positions," Isabella continued. "We're losing our understanding of who we are. And I think that's something everyone can relate to, even if they've never worn a crown." The room was now completely silent. Isabella's unscripted honesty was more compelling than any prepared statement could have been. She was speaking as a human being facing an impossible situation, rather than as a royal figure managing a crisis. "The question isn't just who has the right to wear the crown," she said. "The question is whether the crown means anything at all if it's been passed between people who had no legitimate claim to it for generations. Maybe this is an opportunity to decide what we really want from our institutions and our leaders." At 9:14 a.m., something extraordinary happened. Helen MacDonald, the primary school teacher from Edinburgh who had been identified as another potential heir, appeared at the palace gates. She had driven through the night after receiving the call about her possible royal heritage, and she was now standing in front of hundreds of cameras and thousands of gathered crowds. The security team was completely unprepared for this development. They had planned for media management and crowd control, but not for legitimate heirs showing up unannounced during the press conference that was revealing their existence to the world. Helen MacDonald, still wearing the practical clothes of an elementary school teacher, found herself being escorted through the palace gates while live television coverage captured every step. The symbolism was powerful, a working-class educator potentially about to inherit a throne from a family that had just discovered they had no right to it. Inside the press conference, the arrival of a potential heir created a new level of chaos. Journalists were now trying to cover multiple stories simultaneously: the illegitimate monarchy, the financial crisis, the constitutional implications, and the dramatic arrival of people who might be the real royalty. King Marcus looked at Isabella, then at the chaos surrounding them, and made a decision that would define how history remembered this moment. "I think we need to pause this press conference," he announced. "We clearly need to have conversations with the people who may be the rightful heirs before we can answer your questions about what comes next." But pausing the press conference didn't pause the crisis. If anything, it accelerated it. The admission that the royal family didn't know what came next, combined with the dramatic arrival of potential heirs, created a sense that the country was living through a real-time constitutional collapse. At 9:16 a.m., exactly 13 minutes after the press conference had begun, Prime Minister Richardson received the call that confirmed his worst fears. The Speaker of the House of Commons was demanding an emergency session of Parliament to address the constitutional crisis. The opposition was calling for the government's resignation on the grounds that it derived its authority from an illegitimate crown. The 13 minutes that had begun with a carefully planned announcement had become a free-fall into constitutional chaos. Every assumption about British politics, every certainty about royal authority, every foundation of governmental legitimacy was now in question. Outside the palace, the crowds were growing larger and more restless. Some were calling for the monarchy to be abolished entirely. Others were demanding that the legitimate heirs be installed immediately. A few were protesting that the whole thing was a conspiracy designed to destabilize the country. The police were struggling to maintain order as the situation became increasingly volatile. What had begun as a gathering of curious onlookers was becoming something more serious, a spontaneous demonstration about the very nature of political authority and democratic legitimacy. Isabella stood at the window of the state dining room, looking out at the chaos that her family's revelation had created. In 13 minutes, they had gone from being the symbols of national stability to the catalyst for the biggest political crisis in modern British history. The real question now wasn't whether the monarchy would survive this revelation. The question was whether the country itself could handle the truth about the institutions it had trusted for centuries. The hours following the 13 minutes that changed everything became known as the constitutional collapse, a period when the very foundations of British government seemed to dissolve in real time. By noon on that Tuesday, three separate groups were claiming legitimate authority to rule the country. Parliament was in emergency session, and international allies were questioning whether Britain remained a stable partner. Margaret Foster, the Manchester businesswoman, found herself in the extraordinary position of being escorted through the same palace corridors where she might soon hold ultimate authority. The genetic testing that would confirm her claim to the throne was being expedited through multiple laboratories, but preliminary genealogical evidence strongly supported her position as the legitimate heir. Walking beside her was Helen MacDonald, the Edinburgh teacher whose great-grandmother's stories about royal blood were suddenly being taken very seriously by constitutional lawyers and genetic specialists. The two women, who had never met before that morning, were now potential rivals for a crown that might not even exist by the time their claims were verified. "This is insane," Helen whispered to Margaret as they were led through the palace's grand hallway. "Yesterday, I was teaching fractions to 8-year-olds. Today, I might be responsible for running a country." Margaret nodded, her business training helping her process the surreal situation more analytically than most people could have managed. "The question is whether we even want this responsibility, and whether the country would be better off without a monarchy entirely." Their conversation was being monitored by security personnel who were struggling to understand what protocol applied to potential heirs during a constitutional crisis. The palace staff, many of whom had served the royal family for decades, were facing their own identity crisis as they questioned whom they were supposed to serve. In Parliament, the emergency session had devolved into something approaching chaos. The Speaker of the House was trying to maintain order as MPs from all parties demanded answers that no one could provide. The constitutional experts who had been called to testify were offering conflicting opinions about everything from the government's continued legitimacy to the process for resolving royal succession disputes. The leader of the opposition, David Cameron Jr., had seized the moment to call for the complete abolition of the monarchy. "This crisis proves that the entire institution is a relic that has outlived any useful purpose," he declared to a packed House of Commons. "We have an opportunity to finally become a modern republic, free from the arbitrary authority of hereditary privilege." But the government's position was equally problematic. Prime Minister Richardson found himself defending institutions that might no longer exist while trying to maintain continuity of governance during a crisis that threatened to invalidate every law passed during the current reign. The monarchy's legitimacy crisis doesn't automatically invalidate the democratic processes that exist alongside it, Richardson argued, though his words carried little conviction. Parliament derives its authority from the people, not just from the crown. Constitutional lawyer Professor Elizabeth Warren from Oxford University was called to provide expert testimony, but her analysis only deepened the crisis. If King Marcus never had legitimate authority to grant royal assent to legislation, then, technically every law passed during his reign could be challenged in court. We're looking at a legal nightmare that could take decades to resolve. The international implications were becoming clearer and more serious by the hour. The European Union was questioning whether Britain could honor its international commitments during a constitutional crisis. The United States was privately expressing concerns about the stability of its most important ally. Financial markets around the world were reacting to the possibility that one of the world's oldest democracies was facing complete institutional collapse. At the palace, Isabella found herself in the bizarre position of hosting the women who might replace her family. The three of them sat in the same room where she had learned the truth about her identity less than 24 hours earlier, trying to navigate a situation that had no precedent in modern history. "I need to ask you something," Isabella said to Margaret and Helen. "If the genetic testing confirms that one of you is the legitimate heir, what do you plan to do? Do you want to be queen?" Margaret had been thinking about the same question since receiving the phone call that morning. "I've spent my career building businesses and managing complex organizations. Part of me thinks I could bring some practical skills to the role. But another part of me wonders whether the whole institution should be retired rather than continued." Helen's perspective was different, but equally conflicted. "I've dedicated my life to education and helping children. The resources that go into maintaining the monarchy could fund thousands of schools and libraries. But I also understand that some people find meaning and stability in these traditions. The conversation was interrupted by Thomas Bradley bringing news that would complicate the situation even further. Captain James Morrison, the third identified heir currently serving in Afghanistan, had been contacted and was requesting immediate leave to return to Britain. His military colleagues were describing him as a natural leader who had repeatedly distinguished himself in combat operations. So we might have three legitimate claimants, Isabella observed. A businesswoman, a teacher, and a soldier. It sounds like the beginning of a political science textbook rather than a real situation. More troubling news was coming from Dr. Williams's continued research. Her investigation into the hidden documents was revealing that the pattern of illegitimate succession went back even further than initially discovered. There was evidence suggesting that the royal bloodline had been artificially maintained through adoption, strategic marriages, and deliberate deception for potentially 3 centuries. If this research is accurate, Dr. Williams reported to the gathered group, then the last truly legitimate monarch might have been in the 1600s. The entire modern conception of the British royal family could be an elaborate fiction maintained across generations. The implications were staggering. Every royal ceremony, every constitutional tradition, every basis for the monarchy's authority might be built on centuries of carefully maintained lies. The revelation that had started with King Marcus's adoption was revealing itself to be part of a much larger pattern of institutional deception. Outside the palace, the crowds had grown to over 10,000 people, representing every possible perspective on the crisis. Monarchists were demanding that the legitimate heirs be immediately installed. Republicans were calling for the complete abolition of the royal system. Constitutional experts were trying to explain to anyone who would listen that the legal implications were too complex for simple solutions. The media coverage had become a global phenomenon. International news channels were providing continuous coverage of what they were calling the fall of the British monarchy. Social media was exploding with theories, conspiracies, and debates about the meaning of political legitimacy in the modern world. By 4 p.m., exactly 12 hours after King Marcus had first shared the truth with Isabella, a new development emerged that would reshape the crisis once again. A fourth potential heir had been identified, but this person was fundamentally different from the others. Dr. Patricia Hamilton was a constitutional law professor at Cambridge University who had been quietly researching royal genealogy for decades. Her work had identified her own connection to the legitimate bloodline, but she had never pursued it because she assumed the existing royal family was legitimate. Now, faced with the collapse of the monarchy's foundations, she was being forced to confront the possibility that she might have the strongest legal claim to the throne. Unlike the other potential heirs, Dr. Hamilton had spent her career studying exactly the kind of constitutional crisis they were now facing. She understood the legal, political, and international implications better than anyone else involved in the situation. The irony, she told the BBC in her first public statement, is that I've spent 20 years teaching students about the importance of legitimate constitutional authority. Now I might be the person responsible for restoring it. As evening approached, and the first day of the constitutional crisis came to an end, none of the fundamental questions had been answered. The genetic testing results wouldn't be available for several days. Parliament was deadlocked between those calling for abolition and those demanding restoration of legitimate monarchy. The courts were being flooded with challenges to everything from recent legislation to government authority. Isabella stood again at the palace window, watching the crowds that showed no sign of dispersing. In 24 hours, her understanding of herself, her family, and her country had been completely transformed. The woman who had been preparing to inherit a throne was now watching that throne dissolve into competing claims and constitutional chaos. The revelation that had begun as a family secret had become a national crisis that would reshape British politics for generations to come. The 13 minutes that changed everything had set in motion forces that no one could control or predict. The only certainty was that Britain would emerge from this crisis as a fundamentally different country, whether as a republic, a restored legitimate monarchy, or something entirely new. The institutions that had provided stability for centuries were gone, and what would replace them remained to be written. As the first day of the new reality came to an end, the most important questions still lay ahead. But The process of answering them would determine not just who ruled Britain, but what it meant to rule it all in an age when the foundations of political authority could crumble in 13 minutes of devastating truth.